The day they escorted me out of that building, I had $37 in my bank account, a box of desk items tucked under my arm, and a 13-year-old daughter at home who had no idea that her father had just lost everything. I remember the walk to my car. The parking lot was quiet. It was a Tuesday. 11 in the morning. The kind of morning where the sun is out and the sky is perfectly blue, and the world looks like it has no idea what just happened to you. And somehow that made it worse. The world just kept going. Cars kept passing on the street outside the lot. A woman walked her dog along the sidewalk. A bird landed on the hood of someone's truck. And I stood there next to my old silver Camry, the one with the cracked left side mirror I kept meaning to fix, holding a cardboard box with a coffee mug, a small framed photo of my daughter Lily, a stress ball shaped like a baseball, and a USB drive with 5,000 hours of my professional life saved onto it. 13 years. They took them in 40 minutes. I need you to understand something before I go any further. I was not just an employee at Caldwell and Pierce Engineering. I was the reason that company had its best decade. I designed the load-bearing systems for 3 of their highest-profile infrastructure contracts. I mentored 11 engineers who are now senior staff. My name was in the acknowledgement section of 2 industry publications. I had turned down a competitor offer 3 years earlier, an offer that would have paid me $40,000 more per year, because Marcus Pierce himself had sat across from me at a restaurant and told me I was essential, that this was my home, that they needed me. He used that word, home. 43 days after that conversation, a man named Garrett Holloway arrived. And that right there is where this story really begins. Because everything that happened afterward, all of it, the firing, the desperation, the silence, the phone call that came 7 days later, it all traces back to the day Garrett Holloway walked into Caldwell and Pierce with his tailored suit and his Harvard accent and his promises about a new direction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the end, the real beginning. Because this story is not just about losing a job. It is about who I was before I lost it, what that loss exposed in me and in the people around me, and what happened in the 7 most impossible days of my adult life that I still cannot fully explain to this day. My name is Daniel Reeves. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the kind of place where fathers worked in manufacturing and mothers held things together with quiet determination, and nobody talked about their feelings, but everybody felt them deeply. My father was a structural engineer for a county roads department, not glamorous, not high-paying, but he loved it with a dignity that I absorbed without knowing it. He used to say that a good engineer does not build things to impress people. A good engineer builds things so people can trust what they stand on. I carried that with me to Ohio State, through my graduate degree, through my first job at a smaller firm in Columbus, and eventually to Caldwell and Pierce, where I was hired at 31 years old by Marcus Pierce himself after a 2-hour interview that felt more like a conversation between 2 people who saw the world the same way. By 44, I had become the person people called when a project went sideways, when a calculation did not add up, when a client was nervous, when a deadline felt impossible. I was the one who stayed late, not because someone asked me to, but because I genuinely could not leave something unfinished. My father's voice lived inside my work ethic. I had been divorced for 4 years by then. Carolyn and I had parted on terms that were as civil as 2 people could manage when the marriage had quietly broken down over years of long work hours and emotional distance and 2 people who loved each other but had somehow stopped being good for each other. Lily lived with me every other week, and with her mother the other half. Those weeks with Lily were everything. She was 13, sharp, funny, the kind of kid who asked questions that made you realize you did not know as much as you thought. She wanted to be a marine biologist. She had a poster of a blue whale on her bedroom ceiling. I was not a perfect father. I was not a perfect anything. But I was present, and I was trying, and I had built a life that felt stable enough to stand on. And then Garrett Holloway walked in. He was brought in by the board. That was the first sign something was shifting, and I missed it entirely. Boards do not hire consultants when things are going well. They hire consultants when they want to make changes that the existing leadership would resist. I know that now. I did not know it then, or maybe I knew it, and I convinced myself it was fine because Marcus had given me his word. And Marcus Pierce was the kind of man whose word had always meant something. Garrett was 38, a restructuring specialist with a background in corporate efficiency. He had a way of talking about people that made them sound like budget line items. He used phrases like resource optimization and talent realignment and strategic downsizing with the smoothness of someone who had said them so many times they no longer heard what those words actually meant. What they meant was that people's lives were about to be rearranged for the benefit of a spreadsheet. His first 2 weeks at the firm were quiet. He sat in on meetings. He asked questions. He smiled a lot. He was, on the surface, perfectly pleasant. The kind of person who remembers your name and asks about your weekend and makes you feel temporarily seen before doing something that proves they never saw you at all. I was not afraid of him. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was being honest. 3 weeks in, he asked me to walk him through the current project pipeline. Just the two of us in the conference room, a Tuesday afternoon, coffee on the table. And I did what I always did. I was direct. I told him where we were ahead of schedule, where we were behind, where there were budget concerns on the Meridian Bridge project that I had flagged twice internally and was still waiting on a resolution for. I told him my team was stretched thin. I told him we needed 2 more mid-level engineers to maintain the quality standard the firm was known for. I thought I was helping. I was a 13-year employee telling a new consultant the honest truth so he could do his job effectively. That is what loyalty looks like. That is what caring about a company looks like. What I did not realize was that Garrett Holloway was not there to fix problems. He was there to cut costs. And the problems I had just described to him so candidly, the staffing needs, the budget concerns, the complexity of ongoing projects, those were not things he heard as challenges to solve. Those were things he heard as justifications for restructuring. And somewhere in that conversation, I became a liability. I did not see it coming. That is the part that still sits in my chest, like a stone when I think about it. There were no warning signs I recognized as warning signs. There was no cooling in the room, no shift in how people treated me. Life went on completely normally for another 6 weeks. I managed my team. I hit my deadlines. I showed up every morning the way I had for 13 years. Then, on a Monday in late October, my direct supervisor, a man named Kevin Feld, who I had mentored from a junior engineer to a department head over the course of 8 years, sent me an email at 4:45 in the afternoon, asking me to come in early the next morning for a meeting with him and HR. I read that email standing in my kitchen while Lily was doing homework at the counter. She looked up and asked me if I was okay. I told her I was fine. I told her I just had an early meeting the next day. I did not sleep that night, not because I knew what was coming. I genuinely did not. I did not sleep because I had the vague, formless anxiety of a person who has learned over decades that when HR is in the room, the meeting is not about a promotion. But I could not have told you, lying in the dark at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling, that by noon the next day, I would be walking out of that building with a cardboard box. The meeting was 12 minutes long. Kevin could not look me in the eye for most of it. The HR representative, a woman named Sharon, whose last name I never learned, did most of the talking. She used words like position elimination and workforce restructuring and package details. She slid a single piece of paper across the conference table toward me and explained that I would receive 6 weeks of severance. that my health insurance would continue through the end of the calendar month, and that I was expected to hand over my badge and company laptop before leaving the building that day. 6 weeks. 13 years and 6 weeks. I remember looking at Kevin during that meeting. Really looking at him. He had both hands flat on the table in front of him, and his eyes were fixed on some middle point between us and I. Thought about the afternoon 7 years ago when he had come to my office in a panic because a calculation error had been found in a project report the night before a client presentation, and I had stayed with him until 10 at night, helping him find and fix every single instance of that error so he could walk into that room the next morning with his head held high. I thought about his wedding, where I had given a toast. I thought about the afternoon his son was born, and he had called me from the hospital parking lot, voice cracking, because he was so overwhelmed with joy he did not know who else to call first. He never said a word that morning, not a word. I signed the paper. I stood up. I shook Sharon's hand, because that is the kind of person my mother raised me to be. I went to my office. I packed my box. A security guard I had never seen before stood in the doorway, which I later learned was standard procedure to prevent data theft, but in the moment felt like being treated as a criminal for the crime of trusting people. And then I walked to my car. $37. A cracked side mirror. A box of 13 years. I sat in that parking lot for 22 minutes. I know that because I looked at the clock when I got in, and I looked at it again when I finally turned the key. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I just sat there with the engine off in the quiet of an ordinary Tuesday morning, feeling the particular weight of a life that has just, without warning, been reorganized around you. Then I started the car. I drove home. I called my ex-wife Carolyn from the driveway so that Lily would not hear. Carolyn was quiet for a long moment when I told her, and then she said, "I'm so sorry, Daniel," and she meant it. And somehow, that was the first moment I felt anything close to cracking, because kindness from someone you have hurt is a specific kind of grace. I told her I would be okay. I told her not to worry Lily with it yet. She agreed. I went inside. I made lunch. I sat at my kitchen table with a bowl of soup I could barely taste, and I thought about my father. He had been laid off once when I was 9 years old. A budget cut at the county. 6 months of unemployment. I remember the way the house felt during those months. Quieter, tighter. The way my parents spoke to each other in lower voices. The way my father got up at the same time every morning and put on regular clothes, not pajamas, not a robe, regular clothes, because he said that a man who stops getting dressed stops believing he has somewhere to go. I thought about that for a long time at my kitchen table. Then I got up. I put my bowl in the sink. I went upstairs. I got dressed, and I started making a plan. Now here is where I need to tell you something important. Something that was happening at the same time I was being walked out of that building. Something I had no knowledge of whatsoever. Something that would only come to light later. Because while I was sitting in that parking lot in my cracked mirror Camry, somewhere inside that building, a crisis was already beginning to quietly form. The Meridian Bridge project. I mentioned it earlier. The budget concerns I had flagged twice. The complexity I had laid out honestly for Garrett Holloway in that Tuesday afternoon conference room. What I did not know, what no one had told me, was that in the days following my firing, the project had moved to its next critical phase. The phase that required the specific calculations, the specific load-bearing analysis, the specific methodology that I had developed and that lived, not fully documented, not fully transferred, inside my head and on that USB drive in my cardboard box. But I'm not going to get to that part yet. I am going to make you wait for it the way I had to wait for it. Because the 7 days between my firing and the phone call are not just a backdrop. They are the story. They are the part that changed me. Day 1 was Tuesday. One spent the afternoon making lists. That is how I cope. I am an engineer. When things fall apart, I build a structure to put them back together. I made a list of my expenses. Mortgage, car payment, utilities, food, Lily's school activities. I made a list of my professional contacts. I made a list of firms I could reach out to. I made a list of projects I had worked on that I could discuss in interviews without violating any confidentiality agreement. I made a list of my skills, not the obvious ones, but the quiet ones, the ones I had never had to sell before, because I had always had steady ground under me. That list was longer than I expected. That surprised me. And in the smallest possible way, that surprise was the first breath of something like oxygen in what had felt like a sealed room. That night, Lily came home from school, and we made tacos together the way we always did on Tuesdays. Her job was always the cheese and the sour cream. Mine was the meat and the shells. And she talked about her biology teacher, who had brought in a preserved squid for them to examine. And she was both grossed out and thrilled, and she spoke with her hands, the way she always did when she was excited about something. I watched her and I thought, whatever happens, this is what I am building toward. This exact thing. This Tuesday night taco kitchen with this kid who loves squid. I did not tell her about the job that night. Day 2 was Wednesday. I updated my resume for the first time in 9 years. That alone took most of the morning. Then I reached out to 3 former colleagues at other firms. Just a message, professional, nothing desperate. Letting them know I was exploring new opportunities. That phrase, exploring new opportunities. The polite fiction that everyone in professional life agrees to perform together, because the truth. I was fired on a Tuesday with 6 weeks' pay and $37 in the bank is too raw to lead with. 2 of the 3 responded quickly with warmth. 1, a man named Frank Ortega at a firm in Denver I had met at a conference 4 years earlier, called me directly within 2 hours. He was the first person in the professional world to say your name should never have been on a layoff list and mean it as a compliment rather than a platitude. Frank told me to send my portfolio. He said he could not promise anything, but that they had a project coming up that sounded exactly like my kind of work. He said he would put in a word with his director. It was 1 phone call. It was not a job offer, but it was a door that had opened a crack and let in a little light, and that was more than I had 2 hours earlier. Wednesday night, I told Lily. I had thought about how to say it all day. I had rehearsed different versions. The calm, reassuring version. The honest, but not alarming version. The version that protected her without lying to her. Because here's what I had learned about Lily in 13 years of being her father. She has a radar for pretending. She can feel the difference between truth wrapped in gentleness and a lie wrapped in reassurance. So I sat down with her after dinner, and I told her simply. I told her that the company had made some changes, and my position had been eliminated. I told her that meant I did not have my job anymore, but that I was already talking to other people, and I was going to find something good. I told her it was going to be okay, but I said it the way I had come to say hard things to her over the years, not as a promise I could guarantee, but as a direction I was choosing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that why you were weird at taco night?" I laughed, actually laughed, which was the first time I had laughed since Monday. I told her yes. That was why I was weird at taco night. She got up and hugged me, not the quick hug of a teenager who is distracted, but a real one, the kind where she held on for a few extra seconds. Then she went to her room and came back with her piggy bank, one of those ceramic ones shaped like a fat cartoon pig that she had kept since she was 7, and she put it on the table in front of me. She said, "There is about $60 in there. I want you to have it." I tell people that story, and they ask me why I'm crying. And I tell them, you would understand if you knew her. I told her to keep her $60. I told her we were not there yet. I told her she was the best kid on the planet. She said she knew and went back to her room. Thursday morning arrived with the specific cruelty of a third day of unemployment, which is the day when the initial adrenaline of a crisis has faded and you start doing math. Real math. The kind where you look at your bank balance and your monthly expenses and the number of weeks in your severance and you calculate, with the clarity of a trained engineer, exactly how much runway you have before things become genuinely dangerous. I had about 11 weeks. 11 weeks before I would start needing to make decisions I did not want to make. I also had a mortgage I had refinanced 2 years earlier at a rate that had felt like a victory and now felt like a caller. I had a car payment. I had the regular invisible expenses of a household that add up into a wall when you look at them all at once. 11 weeks. I sent out 4 more applications that morning. I fine-tuned my portfolio. I responded to Frank Ortega's email with everything he had asked for. And then, mid-morning, I did something I had not done in years. I drove to my father's grave. He had passed 3 years earlier. Heart attack. Sudden. The kind of loss that does not prepare you, because there is no way to prepare for someone who has been a permanent feature of your internal landscape, suddenly not being there anymore. I do not visit his grave as often as I should. I am not that kind of person. I am more likely to talk to him in the shower or on a long drive. But that Thursday morning, I needed the specific gravity of that place. I stood at his headstone for a while. The cemetery was quiet. There was a cold wind coming from the north that smelled like the first edge of winter. I talked to him, not out loud, just in the way that people who have lost someone they love talk to them in the silence. I told him what had happened. I told him about the box and the parking lot and Kevin Feld not being able to look me in the eye. I told him about Lily and the piggy bank. I told him I was scared in a way that I was not letting myself fully feel, because if I fully felt it, I was not sure I could keep moving. And I heard his voice, not literally, I want to be clear about that, but in the way that the people who shaped us speak inside us. I heard him say the thing he always said. Do not mistake being still for being stuck. The ground is still ground, even when you cannot feel your feet. I drove home. I got back to work. That afternoon, I had a brief email exchange with a contact at a firm in Seattle. Nothing concrete, but interested. And I found out, through a former colleague who still worked at Caldwell and Pierce and reached out quietly, that I was not the only one. 3 other people had been let go the same week. A project manager, a senior drafter, and an administrative coordinator named Ruth, who had been with the company for 22 years. 22 years. Garrett Holloway had been there for 2 months. I felt something that was not quite anger. Anger is hot. This was colder. It was the specific feeling of watching something you loved be dismantled by someone who had no idea what it was worth, and being powerless to stop it. I made a decision in that moment that I want to be honest about, because it is not a flattering decision, and I think it matters to the story. I made a decision to not reach out to Marcus Pierce, to not call him, not email him, not request a meeting. I had been told my position was eliminated, but I absolutely knew, that Marcus had either approved or at minimum allowed what had happened. That meeting on a Tuesday morning with HR had not been an ambush arranged without the knowledge of a company founder. Those things do not happen in a 12-person leadership structure without the founder knowing. And if Marcus Pierce, the man who had sat across from me in a restaurant and told me this was my home, had let this happen, then he had already answered every question I might ask him. I was not going to beg. That decision cost me something. It cost me the comfort of an explanation. Because if I had called Marcus, maybe I would have gotten a reason. Maybe I would have gotten an apology. Maybe I would have learned something that made it make more sense. But I also believed, with the certainty that lives in your gut rather than your head, that no explanation he could give me would undo what had been done. And I had spent enough of my life being the person who made things easier for other people by absorbing their discomfort. I was done absorbing. Thursday night was hard. It was the first night Lily was back at her mother's, and the house was quiet in the particular way that empty houses are quiet when you have been filled with worry all day. I made pasta. I watched about 20 minutes of a documentary. I cannot even remember. I went to bed early and stared at the ceiling and ran through scenarios and calculations and possibilities until my brain finally, mercifully, let go. Friday, day 4. Something small happened Friday that I keep coming back to when I tell this story because it did not feel significant at the time, but it ended up being one of the threads that everything else pulled through. I stopped at a coffee shop near my neighborhood. I had been there dozens of times. The owner was a woman named Patricia, late 50s, silver hair cut short. One of those people who remembered your order and asked the right questions and made you feel like a regular, even if you had only been in 3 times that month. She made my coffee, slid it across the counter, and said, "You look like a man with something heavy on his mind." I told her I had lost my job that week. She said, "Good." I must have made a face because she laughed and said, "I do not mean good like it is a good thing. I mean good like sometimes the thing that gets taken from us turns out to be the thing that was holding us in place. I lost my restaurant 12 years ago. Bankruptcy, the whole thing. Worst thing that ever happened to me. Best thing that ever happened to me." I asked her what she meant. She said the restaurant I was running was someone else's idea of what I should be doing. This one is mine. I paid for my coffee. I sat in the corner for a while. I thought about what she said. I thought about how I had never once, in 13 years at Caldwell and Pierce, seriously entertained the idea of doing something on my own terms. Not because I lacked the knowledge or the skill or the connections, but because the stability of an established firm had been comfortable enough that I had never needed to ask whether comfortable was the same as right. And I thought, maybe it was not. I am not saying I had a sudden revelation in a coffee shop. I am not that kind of person. But something in me shifted very slightly, like a door that has been painted shut for years that someone just ran a knife along the edge of. Not open, just the beginning of a scene. Friday afternoon, I had a video call with a firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. Preliminary. An intake conversation. But the director of engineering was professional and clearly knew who I was and had read my portfolio before we spoke, which told me something. The call lasted 40 minutes. He said he would be in touch after the holidays, which were still about 7 weeks away. It was not the timeline I was working with, but it was something. Friday evening, I went to the hardware store and fixed my side mirror. Not because it was urgent. Because my father had always said that a man who lets small broken things stay broken is a man who is starting to give up on the details. And the details, he said, are where your character lives. I fixed the mirror. It took 40 minutes. I felt better than I had any right to feel about fixing a car mirror. Saturday, day 5, the weekend. There is something about the weekend, when you are unemployed, that is different from the weekday version of unemployment. On weekdays, the world has a rhythm, and you are slightly out of step with it, but still moving in a recognizable direction. On weekends, everyone is outside their usual rhythm, and suddenly you are not as visibly displaced. But the anxiety does not respect weekends. The math does not take Saturdays off. I went for a run. 6 miles. I had not run regularly in over a year, and my body objected loudly to the first 2 miles. But I kept going because I needed the specific clarity that comes from sustained physical effort. The way the noise in your head quiets down when your body is working hard enough to demand full attention. On the 4th mile, a thought arrived that stopped me so completely, I actually slowed to a walk in the middle of the path. the USB drive. I had not thought about it since I packed it in the box. It was still sitting on my desk at home. And on that USB drive was something that went far beyond my resume and my portfolio samples. It contained years of working files, project documentation, my proprietary calculation methodology for composite load-bearing systems, something I had developed over 3 years of iterative work on challenging projects, including the Meridian Bridge project. Now, I want to be careful about something here, because I am an ethical person, and I want to be clear about what I mean and do not mean. I did not steal anything. I did not take anything that was not mine. When you work at a firm for 13 years, and you bring your own laptop and work from home on weekends and develop methodologies through your own intellectual process, the lines of ownership over certain kinds of knowledge are not always simple. That USB drive had been my backup drive for personal notes, calculation scratch work, half-developed ideas, the messy working documents that never make it into official project files. The official project files were on the company server. Those were theirs. The methodology I had developed, the deep framework behind the calculations that lived in both places. And as I stood on that running path on a cold Saturday morning, breathing hard, I realized something. If there was anyone at Caldwell and Pierce who fully understood the structural approach I had used on the Meridian Bridge, it was me. If there was anyone who had documented it fully enough to hand off to another engineer without significant risk, it was me. And I had just been fired. I stood there on that path for a long time. Then I started running again. And I thought about what I actually wanted to happen next, not what I feared, not what seemed likely, what I wanted. I wanted to find work I was proud of. I wanted to keep my house. I wanted to be present for Lily. I wanted to build something that felt like mine. And somewhere underneath all of that, in a place I was not quite ready to look at directly, I wanted the people who had dismissed me after 13 years to understand what they had done, not for revenge. I want to be honest about that, because revenge is a simple motive, and this was not a simple feeling. It was more like wanting the truth to surface, wanting the world to accurately reflect the value of a thing before that thing was gone. I ran the last 2 miles faster than I have run anything in years. Saturday afternoon, something else happened. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I did not immediately recognize. The message said, "Hey, Daniel. It is Ruth Calloway. I do not know if you remember me. I was the admin coordinator at C&P. We let me go this week, too. I just wanted to reach out and say that the way they treated you was wrong. Everyone on the support staff knew it. I just thought you should hear that." I stared at that text for a long time. Ruth Calloway. I remembered her. Of course I remembered her. 22 years. She knew where everything was in that building. She remembered birthdays and filing deadlines and the names of people's kids. She was the kind of person an institution runs on while collectively forgetting to notice. I texted back. I told her I was sorry it had happened to her too. I asked if she was okay. She said she would be. She said she had actually been thinking about retiring in the next year or two anyway, and maybe this was the universe giving her a push. She said something that hit me in a way I was not expecting. She said, "You always treated everyone in that building like they mattered." Not everyone did. I will not forget that. I put my phone down, and I sat with that for a while. I think about the things people say about you when you are not in the room. I think about how rarely those things are ever said to your face. And I thought about how the person at Caldwell and Pierce, who saw me most clearly, turned out to be the woman who answered phones and managed schedules, and had been there longer than almost anyone. Sunday, day 6. Sundays had been Lily days for the past 2 years. Every other Sunday, I would pick her up from Carolyn's, and we would do something together. A hike, a museum, a movie. Once a terrible pottery class that we both found hilarious, because neither of us has any aptitude for pottery whatsoever. Our attempts looked like geological disasters. This Sunday, she wanted to go to the aquarium. We drove 40 minutes to the city aquarium and walked through all the exhibits, and I watched her light up in front of the jellyfish tank the way she always did. Because jellyfish were her exception to her marine biology focus. She was supposed to be all about ecosystems and biodiversity. But jellyfish just absolutely got her on a purely aesthetic level. She thought they were the most beautiful things in the ocean. She pressed her forehead against the glass. The jellyfish pulsed in the blue light. She said, "Dad, do you know that jellyfish do not have brains?" I said I did know that. She said, "And they have been on Earth for 500 million years. I said that was something to think about. She said, "So maybe you do not need to have everything figured out to survive." She was not talking about jellyfish. I looked at her. She was still looking at the tank, 13 years old, forehead against the glass. And I thought, I raised this person. Whatever else has happened, whatever else is coming, I helped make this person. We drove home mostly in comfortable quiet, the radio low, the early dark of autumn coming down around the car. She fell asleep on the way back, and I sat with the quiet, and I let myself feel, fully and without managing it, the uncertainty that I had been keeping at a controlled distance all week. I was scared. I was genuinely scared. Not panicked. Not broken. But scared in the way that honest people get scared when they are standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, and they do not have a guarantee of the other side. And I made a choice in that car, watching the highway lights pass overhead, my daughter sleeping in the seat beside me. I decided to call the Seattle firm back first thing Monday morning and push for a faster conversation. I decided to email Frank Ortega in Denver and ask directly whether there was a timeline on the project he had mentioned. I decided that 11 weeks was enough runway to build something if I used every hour of it. I decided that I was not going to spend any more mental energy on Caldwell and Pierce, or Garrett Holloway, or Kevin Feld, or what any of them thought or felt or deserved. I was going to look forward. That was Sunday night. Monday morning, day 7, everything changed. I was up at 6, showered, dressed, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, going through my email, preparing what I was going to say to Frank and to Seattle. Lily was still at her mother's. The house was quiet and purposeful in the way it gets when you have made a decision and you have stepped into its current. My phone rang at 7:43 in the morning. The number was Caldwell and Pierce's main line. I sat there and watched it ring. I will be honest with you. My first instinct was not to answer. Not because I was playing some kind of game, but because I had made a decision to look forward, and that number represented everything I had decided to stop orienting toward. It rang 4 times. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the same number called back. I answered. The voice on the other end was not Kevin Feld. It was not H.R. Sharon. It was not Garrett Holloway. It was Marcus Pierce himself, the man who founded the company, the man who had told me over dinner 3 years ago that I was essential, that this was my home. His voice was different from how I remembered it, tighter, something in it that I had never heard from him before in 13 years. He said, "Daniel, I need to talk to you about the Meridian Bridge." I did not say anything right away. I let the silence sit there between us for a moment, because I thought the silence deserved to exist. Then I said, "I am listening." What he told me in the next 4 minutes was, on the surface, a structural and logistical crisis. What it actually was, underneath all the technical language, was a confession. After I had been let go, the Meridian Bridge project had moved into its critical structural analysis phase. My team, now reorganized and understaffed in the way I had warned it would be, had discovered that the load distribution methodology in the existing project files did not fully account for the specific soil variability data that had come back from the latest ground survey. The analysis I had been developing, which lived partially in my working documents and almost entirely in my head and on that USB drive, was the missing piece. Without it, the project was stalled. Not inconveniently stalled. Critically stalled. They had a client meeting in 9 days. The structural sign-off was contractually required before that meeting. Without my methodology, they would need to start the analysis from scratch with an outside consultant, which would take weeks and cost the firm somewhere in the range of $300,000 in delays and penalties and consultant fees, and there was a genuine question about whether the timeline was even recoverable. Marcus Pierce was calling me on a Monday morning 7 days after firing me to ask for my help. I want to describe what I felt in that moment accurately, because it would be easy to describe it as triumph, and that is not quite right. There was something in it that resembled vindication. There was something in it that resembled a cold, clear kind of satisfaction. But there was also something more complicated. Something that had to do with the fact that I had genuinely loved that company and watching it arrive at a crisis of its own making, even one that proved something I believed, was not purely satisfying. It was like watching a house you used to live in catch fire. You are outside, you are safe, and some part of you knew the wiring was bad, but it is still a house on fire. I told Marcus that I needed time to think. He said, "Daniel, I understand that what happened was not handled well. I want to have a real conversation about that. But right now, I am asking you as one professional to another. This project is about public infrastructure. People will use this bridge. We need to know the analysis is right." He knew exactly where to press, because here is the thing. I did not care about Caldwell and Pierce. I had moved past caring about what happened to that firm the moment I drove out of that parking lot. But the bridge was a different thing entirely. Public infrastructure means real people. Real load-bearing capacity means real safety. My father's voice, again. A good engineer does not build things to impress people. A good engineer builds things so people can trust what they stand on. I thought about the bridge. I thought about the people who would drive across it, parents with kids in the back seat. Lily, someday on some road. The anonymous millions of people who never think about the calculations behind the concrete and steel they trust their lives to. And I thought about what I wanted, not revenge, not just vindication. I wanted to be paid for my work. I wanted the truth of my value to be formally acknowledged. And I wanted it done in a way that was on my terms, not theirs. I told Marcus I would consider coming in to consult. I told him it would be as an independent contractor, not as a returning employee. I told him my rate would reflect the emergency nature of the engagement and the specific expertise they required. I told him I wanted it in writing before I sat down with anyone. There was a pause on his end. Then he said, "We can do that." I told him I would send terms by noon, and he could respond by 3. If the terms were acceptable, I would come in the following morning. We hung up. I sat very still at my kitchen table. The coffee in my mug had gone cold while I was on the call. Outside the window, the morning was doing what mornings do, light moving through the trees. A neighbor's car backing out of a driveway. Ordinary, completely ordinary. I opened my laptop. I typed an email to Frank Ortega in Denver. I told him that something had come up that I needed to navigate in the next 2 weeks, but that my interest in speaking further was very real, and asked if we could schedule something for the following month. He responded within the hour. He said, of course, and by the way, his director had loved my portfolio. Take care of what you need to take care of. Then I spent the next 2 hours drafting the most carefully worded consulting terms I had ever written in my professional life. I sent them to Marcus Pierce at 11:58. He responded at 2:47. He accepted every single term. The rate I had asked for was, I should tell you, more than 4 times my previous daily salary. I had calculated it based on the emergency premium, the specificity of the expertise, the timeline pressure, and, yes, a number that I thought accurately reflected what 13 years of institutional knowledge was actually worth in a crisis. It was not punitive. It was honest. It was the market rate for the thing they had thrown away and then desperately needed back. Marcus Pierce accepted every single term. I put my phone down. I walked to the window. I looked out at the neighborhood at the ordinary mid-morning of a Monday in late October. I called Lily. She was at school and did not pick up, but I left her a voicemail. I said, "Hey, sweetheart. It is Dad. Just calling to tell you that things are going to be okay. Not just okay, actually. I think they might be better than okay. I will explain tonight. Have a good day. I love you." Then I called Patricia at the coffee shop. She answered on the second ring, slightly surprised to hear from me on her personal cell, which I had from a neighborhood directory. I said, "You told me that losing your restaurant was the best thing that ever happened to you. I just wanted to tell you that I think I am starting to understand what you meant." She laughed. She said, "Good. Come in tomorrow. First coffee is on me." I went in the next morning. But before that, I want to tell you about what happened that evening, because it is the part of this story that I return to most often. Not the phone call from Marcus. Not the terms I sent. Not the rate he accepted. Those things matter. But this is the part that matters more. I called my mother that night. She lives in Ohio still, in the same house I grew up in, and she is 71 and sharp and has the particular wisdom of a woman who has outlived a husband and a set of expectations and several versions of a world she thought she understood. I had not told her about the firing. I did not want to worry her. I told her that night. Everything. The meeting. The box. The parking lot. The 7 days. The phone call. The terms. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Your father would have done exactly what you did." I asked her which part. She said, "All of it. The list making. The running. The mirror. The not calling Marcus to beg. And the going back on your own terms." I said, "I almost answered on the first ring." She said, "But you did not." "No, I did not." She said, "That is the part he would have been most proud of." I went to Caldwell and Pierce the next morning. I walked in through the front door, not the side entrance I had always used as an employee. I checked in at the front desk. I signed the visitor log. I was given a visitor badge, not an employee badge. These distinctions mattered to me in ways I cannot fully explain, but will not pretend did not matter. Kevin Feld was in the lobby when I walked in. He saw me before I saw him. I watched something complicated happen on his face. Something between relief and shame and the specific discomfort of a person who has done something they cannot undo, meeting the person they did it to. He said, "Daniel, thank you for coming." I said, "I am here for the project." And I meant that, not coldly, not as a rebuke, just as a statement of reality. I was not there for a reconciliation. I was not there to make him feel better about what had happened. I was there because there was a bridge, and the bridge needed to be right. We went into the conference room. The same conference room where Garrett Holloway had sat across from me 6 weeks earlier and listened to me be honest about the problems I saw. Garrett was not there. I had included in my terms that the engagement would not involve him directly. Marcus had agreed without pushback. I thought about what that meant about the standing Garrett now held in that building. I did not pursue the thought. Marcus was there. He looked older than I remembered, which surprised me because it had only been a month and a half. He stood up when I came in. He extended his hand. I shook it. He said, "I owe you more than this conversation can address today." I said, "You do. But today is for the bridge." I spent 3 days at Caldwell and Pierce as a consultant. 3 days in which I worked alongside two of my former team members, neither of whom would meet my eyes on the first day, but both of whom thawed somewhat by the third. 3 days in which I transferred, formally and completely, and in documented form, the methodology and analysis that the project required. 3 days of the most focused, precise, satisfying engineering work I had done in a long time, because there is something clarifying about work when you are doing it as a free agent, when there is no hierarchy above you, when you are there purely because of what you know. On the third afternoon, I sat down with Marcus Pierce in his office. Just the two of us. He told me what I already knew, but needed to hear from him. He told me that Garrett Holloway had recommended my position for elimination as part of a cost reduction strategy, and that he, Marcus, had approved it without the due diligence it deserved. He said he had trusted a consultant's analysis over his own 13 years of working alongside me. He said he had been wrong. I let him say it. All of it. I did not interrupt. I did not tell him it was okay, because it was not okay. And he knew that, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. But I also did not carry rage at him, because rage is heavy, and I had been carrying enough already. When he finished, I told him one thing. I said, I hope you will remember this when the next consultant comes in with a spreadsheet and tells you what is efficient. Efficiency is not the same as value. Some things that look inefficient on paper are the things that hold everything else up. He nodded. He looked out the window for a moment. Then he said, Are you happy where you are going? I told him I did not know yet, but that I was going somewhere that was mine. That I had spoken to a firm in Denver who wanted me on a project in the spring, and I was going to do it as an independent contractor, the way I had come to Caldwell and Pierce on my own terms. And I told him I had started thinking about something I had not let myself think about in years, starting my own practice, small, focused on exactly the kind of complex structural work I was best at. No overhead that did not need to exist. No committees. No Garrett Holloways. He said, If you do that, and you are willing, I would like to be a reference. I thought about that for a moment. I said, I know. I left that building for the last time on a Thursday afternoon. No box this time. Nothing to carry. I walked out through the front door, past the receptionist who said goodbye, Mr. Reeves, and into the parking lot where my Camry sat with its repaired side mirror catching the thin October sun. I drove to Patricia's coffee shop. She saw me come in and put a cup on the counter before I reached it. I sat down and drank my coffee, and I thought about my father, and I thought about Lily and the jellyfish and the $60 in the ceramic pig and Ruth Calloway's text message, and the running path and the hardware store, and Marcus Pierce's voice on the phone, and the specific quality of the silence in a crisis that happens when the person who knows how to fix it is no longer in the building. I thought about what I was building. 2 months later, I registered my own LLC, Reeves Structural Engineering and Consulting. I used the garage that had never had a car in it as my office. I put my father's old drafting table against the wall under the window. I bought a decent coffee maker and a good lamp and a whiteboard that covered most of one wall. The Denver project with Frank Ortega started in February. It was the kind of work I had not done in years. Complex, creative, genuinely challenging. The kind of problem where you fall asleep thinking about it and wake up with a different angle on it. Frank's firm was collaborative and direct, and they trusted me because they had hired me for a specific thing and then let me do it. By April, I had 2 more contracts. One came through a contact from a former colleague. One came through Marcus Pierce, who had, as promised, put my name forward to a client who needed exactly what I offered. I accepted that referral, not without thinking about it, not without the particular irony of building something partly on the foundation of the connection with the man who had let me be pushed out. But I accepted it because one of the things I had learned in those 7 days was the difference between holding a grudge and holding a principle. A principle says, I will not be treated this way again, and I will not return on those terms. A grudge says, I will refuse anything that touches this story. Principles are useful. Grudges are just weight. By summer, I was earning more than I had at Caldwell and Pierce. Not dramatically more, not yet, but more. More with ownership. More with control. More with the specific dignity of doing work that was fully mine. Lily came to my office one Saturday in June. She looked at the whiteboard covered in calculations, and she looked at my father's drafting table, and she looked at the framed photo. Of the two of us, I had moved from the cardboard box to the corner of my desk. She said, I like it in here. I said, me too. She said, Dad, can I ask you something? I said, of course. She said, are you happier now than before? I thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved, because she was not asking about money or stability or any of the measurable things. She was asking about something harder to name. I told her, yes, I think I am. I think losing that job was the most frightening thing that had happened to me in a long time. And I think I was so busy being good at something that I had stopped asking whether it was the right something. And the universe, or whatever you want to call it, made that choice for me in a way that I did not ask for and would not have chosen. She thought about that. Then she said, so Garrett Holloway kind of accidentally helped you. I laughed for a long time at that. She is not wrong. I have thought about that many times since. Garrett Holloway, who came into that building with his efficiency models and his resource optimization and his talent realignment, who looked at 13 years of knowledge and relationship and institutional memory and saw a line item to be cut, accidentally handed me the thing I needed most. He cut me loose. And sometimes the thing that feels like being cut loose is actually being set free. I want to be careful with that sentiment, because I am not going to stand here and tell you that losing your job is secretly a gift. For many people, it is a genuine catastrophe with consequences that do not resolve beautifully. I was fortunate in ways I knew, and in ways I am still discovering. I had skills that transferred. I had savings that lasted long enough. I had a daughter who gave me her ceramic pig. I had a woman named Patricia who made good coffee and said the right thing at the right moment. I had a father whose voice lived inside my work ethic. Not everyone has all of those things. I know that. But here is what I believe, and I believe it the way I believe in load-bearing calculations, which is to say, I believe it because I have tested it against reality, and it has held. The ground does not disappear when you cannot feel your feet. It is still there. And sometimes the only way to find better ground is to lose the ground you are standing on. That is not a comfort that means much in the first 24 hours, or the first week, or maybe even the first month, but it is something worth holding on to in the dark, because the dark ends. I know it ends because I was in it. I sat in a parking lot on a Tuesday morning with $37 and a cracked side mirror and a box of 13 years under my arm. I did the math and felt the weight and heard the silence and ran through the yell, nighttime scenarios, and lay awake listening to the calculations in my head. And then a phone rang on a Monday morning, and the man who had let me be thrown away was calling to ask me to come back, because the thing they had dismissed was the thing holding everything else up. And I answered on the second ring, and I said, I am listening. And I set my own terms. And I walked out of that building for the last time on a Thursday afternoon with nothing in my hands and everything in my direction. Garrett Holloway was gone from Caldwell and Pierce by December. I heard that through the same quiet network of former colleagues that had told me about the other layoffs. The efficiency strategy had not produced the results the board had hoped for. Apparently, the costs of losing experienced people, the knowledge gaps, the project delays, the consultant fees, The client concerns about continuity had exceeded the salary savings by a significant margin. I thought about that for a moment when I heard it. Then I went back to my whiteboard. Some equations balance. It just takes a little time to see the full calculation. Lily is 14 now. She is doing a summer research program focused on ocean ecosystems. She still loves jellyfish. She still puts her forehead against the glass of the tank. My practice is growing. I have 2 associates now, both young engineers I found through the same university my father pointed me toward, and both of them remind me of who I was when I started, hungry and precise and learning to trust what they know. I have not replaced my father's drafting table with anything more modern. I use it every day, and some mornings, very early, before anyone else is in the office. Before the city is fully awake, I sit at that table with coffee, and I look at the calculations on my whiteboard, and I feel something I did not have a name for a long time. I think the name for it is this: I am standing on ground that is mine, and I can feel my feet.